What would you do if you called 911 for an ambulance and they told you no one was available? Today on the County Seat, we will discuss the EMS crisis facing many communities across the state of Utah and some of the solutions legislators are proposing to keep EMS services viable. County Seat is next. The County Seat is brought to you this week by Jones and DeMille Engineering, helping to shape your quality of life. Find out more at jonesanddemille.com. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the County Seat. I'm your host, Chad Booth. Today we are talking about, here at the Utah State Capitol during the legislative session, an issue that has come to the forefront. It has been long brewing. It is a serious problem in rural parts of the Utah, and it's about emergency medical services. We brought you a show to introduce you to the topic not even 2 months ago. And we are revisiting it as there are many pieces of legislation that are trying to respond to it. We'll see how they all fit together and look at the different approaches. Joining us for this first segment is a legislator that has got some legislation in play. This is Representative Deron Owens, and he's from the Juab-San Pete area. And the other Darin, his brother, Darin Bushman, who's a county commissioner from Piute County, I might add, an EMT, an ambulance driver, and general all-around good guy.
Yeah. Thanks,
Thank you
Chad.
for joining us.
Thanks.
Why is this become such a big crisis?
Well, rural Utah is really struggling right now. We have a lot of ambulance services across the state that are out of service a large portion of the time because they just don't have volunteers and they can't get volunteers trained and through the certification process and into the agencies. Financially, it's very difficult to support. The Bureau of EMS just come out with some numbers that said somewhere in the neighborhood of $30.7 million was lost by agencies in the state providing EMS services. If you take the for-profit ambulance services out of that equation, it even goes up. It's $35 million that was lost across the state trying to provide emergency medical services. There's a huge delta between billings and collections. Across the state, it runs between 40 and 50% on ambulance collections. So I know none of our constituents like getting big ambulance bills, but at the end of the day, we're really only collecting between 40 and 50% of that.
How did you come up on this, and what are you proposing?
I came on board with a meeting that was held in Richfield last fall. I was invited to with other representatives and legislators, and there was about 60 EMS folks from around the state who showed up, and we had a workshop, and in that day came up with about 300 different possible solutions or helps with this issue. That's when I realized that we need to bring some attention to this. The citizens of Utah, I think, feel like they are covered when they're out in the outback country and rural Utah areas, that they have the EMS coverage, and it's really not the case. So in our state, we probably should provide that and just some support. Now, in some places it works. I know in Ephraim and San Pete County, there's some areas that have private 501c3 organizations, but not all of rural Utah.
But anytime that you have that in play, it really requires a certain kind of population base to even make that work. Ephraim, while from Salt Lake standards, people would think, well, that's a dinky little town, but then there's Marysvale, where you're from, and that's just even microscopic. How can you even, I mean, you guys were struggling just to have a place to park your ambulance, weren't you?
Sure. Well, in the small communities, you could tax and tax and tax, but when you have such a small tax base to begin with, and our whole county is 1,550 people, how much can you tax the local citizens to provide a service like this, And that's really where the tough questions have to be answered, is where does the funding come from to do this?
So what are you proposing as part of the solution?
Well, I'm running the EMS amendments bill, and there's a few ideas behind that. One is the funding source to help this, and it doesn't need to be a ton of money to help fill these areas of need. One thought that we had was to move the entire EMS system over underneath the Department of Public Service. That's who they communicate with on a daily basis. DPS is out there on every accident, and it seems to make sense to a lot of people if we just move that under them and that leadership under Commissioner Anderson. However, at this point, we're just making maybe some adjustments to see if we can recuperate some funding. In 2009, $1.7 million was pulled back from EMS services at the downturn of the economy. That's never been recovered. So all of this now 10 more years later, those sources have pulled in to the populous areas and away from some of the rural areas of need. So that's the bill I'm running.
So you're working at trying to get some money back out into rural Utah.
Some money, a little restructuring, maybe some reporting. Just it's not that it's not important, but it's almost forgotten the outlying areas. So trying to get some help there.
How's the bill look? I mean, are all of the pieces of legislation getting good attention?
I have some another meeting with Speaker Wilson this afternoon with some ideas of how we can pull a few dollars here and there and not make it a big fiscal note, because that's just not available this year.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. We'll come back, continue our conversation, trying to bring you up to speed on all the legislation that is tackling this issue. We'll be right back on the county seat. Welcome back to County Seat. We are continuing our conversation about the EMS crisis and some of the legislation that is coming up on the Hill and some different perspectives. Joining us for this segment is Karl Albrecht, District 70, and thank you, Karl, for joining us for this conversation.
Appreciate being
What's
here.
your take on this?
My take is we better get some funding out of the legislature to get this ball rolling, and I have a meeting with the governor's office this afternoon to talk about it.
In the process of trying to find different avenues for funding and mechanisms, you originally had a bill that put in a tap for TRT on this and has been removed. Does it necessarily completely exclude a county from being able to make some of the EMS things part of their TRT expenditures?
No, we had a sentence or two in there that allowed the counties to add 1% or so to their budgets through the transient room tax, but it had to receive county approval. So the commissioners were on the hook for basically a tax increase. My bill now, as it's constituted, the counties can use some of that above the cap. There's a floor in it using 2018 numbers, and then a new percentage for years going forward on transient room tax revenues, and they'll be able to use a percentage of that for EMS services if they want to.
Darin, does this make sense to you as far as in the EMS picture that you're asking out-of-town visitors to pay for ambulance service?
It absolutely makes sense. We can only tax our citizens so much. And the reality of it is, we have 120 runs a year. 70 to 80 of them are basically out-of-town visitors. And all those runs happen between basically June and October. And so it makes sense that that burden rests with someone outside of Piute County, and obviously the visitors are usually the ones that are getting themselves in trouble, and so it does make sense. The big question mark is, how do you get that? We've talked about transient room tax. That's an obvious target, right? We've talked about the TRCC, which is the restaurant tax. That's another opportunity where we could go. There's been suggestions of a statewide tax on your license plate tags or other mechanisms, but it kind of makes sense. It's a statewide issue. We are the Wasatch Front's playground, and so we need some assistance in being able to provide the services they need.
Are you worried about the fact that if we don't do something about finding help for staffing and equipment, and that there will be a time when somebody will just not have an ambulance that will come?
I'm extremely worried, Chad, and the situation is that I represent about 25 communities in 4 different counties. And as Commissioner Bushman mentioned, we are the playground for the Wasatch Front and the international folks that come to visit us and out-of-state folks. And if one of those communities, one of those tourists had an accident similar to what we had down by Ruby's Inn last fall, and we don't get ambulance service to them, and then the family sues us, and they're going to sue the county and they're going to sue the state. And so I'm extremely worried about that.
Did the Bryce Canyon bus accident actually trigger a lot of this concern, Darin?
It did, and of course we've had the concern. It's been brewing for a long time, but when that happened, my sheriff got in an empty ambulance and drove it to the scene, and we had EMTs responding from as far north as Gunnison, 100 miles to get there to staff an ambulance. And so it's a very real concern. I pulled the numbers from our dispatch times, and you've got an opportunity in Piute County that if you dial 911 and need an ambulance service, roughly depending upon the month, time of year, between 18 and 35% chance that what the answer you're going to get is, yeah, we'll send you an ambulance. It's going to come from Garfield County or it's going to come from Sevier County. We just had one I shared with the representative. We had an 86-year-old male who had fallen, and the Garfield County ambulances were an hour out. Piute was out of service, and the ambulance had to come out of Monroe. Well, that's 45 minutes at best response time. Compound fracture, okay? You deal with that and you have a femoral artery or something like that, a injury of that nature, that's a fatality that didn't need to be a fatality.
Karl, do you think there's a chance that there'll be a measurable relief within this session of the legislature on this?
I think there'll be some kind of relief. I know Representative Owens has a priority bill on it, and like I say, I've got some meetings on it with the governor's office and leadership. We're trying to find some funding. I think leadership realizes there's a problem and would like to help us solve it. Whether we get the full measure this year or not, I don't know, but I think we'll get something that'll help.
Well, we'll continue this conversation. Thank you for joining us for this segment, and we'll let you get to that meeting with the governor, and we'll be back with the county seat in just a minute. Welcome back to the county seat. We're talking about the developing situation on solving the EMS problem. We brought you this story 2 months ago, and we're giving you a legislative update. Joining us for this segment is one of my favorite representatives on the Hill, Phil Lyman, a former county commissioner from San Juan County. Thank you for joining us. And of course, we continue with Darin, who is our resident ambulance driver. You obviously have some concerns about this too, from your perspective. What are you bringing to the table to try and solve this problem?
Well, the concerns are that EMS is in a crisis mode, and people who need service are not getting it. And then the problem is money, funding. So the one avenue that we've got right now, counties can assess a 1% sales tax, and they can use it in the 5th and 6th class counties. The smaller counties, they can use it for emergency services. In the 3rd and 4th class counties, it has to be used for a healthcare facility. And what we're doing is trying to expand that out so that the 4th class counties at least, and maybe the 3rd class counties as well, will be able to use that for emergency services if they so choose.
And what are the downsides of this? I mean, there's some upsides and downsides. Could this be the single standalone cure for the problem?
Well, it has the potential to raise a significant amount of money, but it's not enough. It's not enough to fix the problem. The downsides potentially on this is that counties that don't have that tax in place right now might put it in place, and their citizens will pay a little bit more. But I like a sales tax in these counties because they have a lot of visitors, so it helps to share the burden of that service, which that service has to be there. And it helps to share that service, the burden of that service, with visitors.
It's not totally the fix. I think it's a really good step forward with counties in that classification, and counties that have a fairly sizable population base this is an opportunity for them. They may not have hospitals or hospitals in all their areas. This is an opportunity for them to share a portion of this tax with EMS or all of this tax with EMS. And so it certainly helps to fund those organizations. It's not the be-all, end-all, but it's a good step forward. And I think what the representative's doing really does help with the flexibility in those, potentially third and for sure fourth class counties.
Are you ever concerned about the fact that when you have several bills coming up to try and address a really big problem, and I think rural EMS is probably as big a rural problem as is facing the legislature this year. But is there ever a concern that people, your colleagues, will look at it and say, well, we already passed that one, that should be enough?
Right. Yeah. It's a huge concern, and that's the message that we keep trying to send, is that this whatever the problem is, it's got to be addressed one way or the other. Whether it's going to be by making an essential service, putting it under DPS, getting more taxes, all of those things are trying to solve a problem. And my fear is that someone will say, yeah, well, we took care of that with this bill, when that really just addresses a tiny part of it. Even if we passed all three of the pieces of legislation that are on the table right now, we'd still be dealing with the EMS problem.
Excellent. Well, you got any final thoughts on this as far as, are you optimistic about what you're running?
I'm really optimistic about my bill. I've had no resistance, even from those healthcare facilities that rely on this tax. They recognize that this is a problem.
Well, they rely on EMSs too.
They rely on EMS too. Yeah. It's an essential service. There's no question it's an essential service. And I guess my main appreciation goes to Commissioner Bushman for bringing this to the front. He's a person who's on the ground actually doing EMS and trying to run a county and trying to
run the ambulance.
And run the ambulance. Yeah. I mean, if there's somebody who understands the problem, it's those people at the local level, and that's why we've got to empower local communities to fix this problem, and not just say, well, come up with money someplace. We've got to give them an avenue where they can come up with the money.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Commissioner Lyman. Thank you,
That'd
Representative
be a promotion,
Lyman, for joining us. And we'll come back with one more perspective on this on the county seat. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the county seat, our final segment to talk about the EMS crisis across the state and the different approaches that the legislature is taking to solve it. Our final guest is Representative Dan Johnson from up Logan Way, District 4, and you are additionally running some legislation. Darin, you pointed out that Representative Johnson's bill ended up at the very point that you thought was interesting, but you came from opposite direction.
Yeah, they were working on a problem in Cache County. We were working on a problem in rural Utah, and interestingly enough, they converged. And I got a phone call one day that said, "Have you seen Representative Johnson's plan for this?" And it really comes down to designating EMS as an essential service. As you know, fire and police are designated as essential services, but emergency medical services is not.
What's at the heart of your bill, Representative Johnson?
Really, the heart of the bill is getting people to come around the table and to negotiate what the prices would be for sharing in the cost of EMS services. And also working with Chief Hanig in Logan, discovered, and I was really surprised at this, is that EMS is not considered an essential service. So I just think that there's got to be a way for people to come around the table, try to solve this problem in cities and in counties, but not only in Cache County, but across our state. This is an issue that goes way beyond our county.
So if there's one area that had been covering outside of its boundaries, but it was designated as an essential service, the service had to be provided, what would be the obligation of the communities that were receiving the service but not basically funding it?
Yeah, well, you know, the state law EMS says that they do the licensing, and they do licensing for a geographical area, and it says that that service shall be provided. But what ends up happening, it doesn't say who's going to pay for it. So that's the issue, and that's the reason that this bill, House Bill 190, is entitled Local Government Cooperation Contracts. And so the intent is not to gouge anyone, but just for everyone who is getting service, then pay at some level that is, commensurate with the level of service that you're receiving.
How will this help in counties like yours?
It'll help a ton. You know, Chad, there's a piece of misinformation relative to ambulance services, and I think it comes from, you get an ambulance bill, it's a pretty big bill, and you go, oh geez, this must be a real moneymaker. But it's not. Like I said, ambulance services across the state are losing $30–40 million a year providing the services. And so this will bring all of the entities to the table. Right now you have counties that are abdicating responsibility to services, and you have municipalities that are abdicating responsibilities to services. And what Representative Johnson's bill does is it gets the whole team on the field. Let's get the team on the field. The old saying, it says if nobody's designated with responsibility, nobody has responsibility. Mm-hmm. That's where we're at, right? Nobody's designated with responsibility right now. So by having the counties and the municipalities on board, now there's ownership.
If we can get all of these legislative pieces done that we've talked about, and we can get them into law next year, will Utah be a safer place next year?
Mm. Yeah, I think it will be. I just feel like, when somebody has a heart attack or there's an accident and they're out away, who's going to help them? And if there isn't service that is provided at a really higher level, I think people they're in danger. So that I just think it's going to be very helpful all across the state.
I think it'll be a giant leap towards the solution. I wouldn't say that it's going to be a cure-all. There's no silver bullet for this. We came up with 300 ideas to solve this problem.
Or a silver stretcher.
Yeah, or a silver stretcher. But I think it will definitely be a step in the right direction.
Well, gentlemen, thank you for joining me. Thank you for paying attention to this. This is one of those issues where you really need to get on the horn with your legislator. You probably don't need to call Representative Johnson if he's your representative, because he's already on board. But let them know that this is an important issue to you, whether you live on the Wasatch Front in a populated area because you go play out in rural Utah, or whether you're from rural Utah. These issues need to be addressed. Share this conversation and share your comments with us about it. Maybe you've got that silver stretcher out there in your repertoire and you can find something that can help on this. We love the conversation, and we will talk to you next week on The County Seat. Thank you for watching The County Seat. Be sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications to keep up to date on the program and happenings around Utah.